hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Last weekend, I was away in Pennsylvania. Margaret and I changed weekends. She was planning on preaching on the Columbus Day weekend, but then her children were all gathering in Massachusetts, and it just made sense for us to change weekends around. So she's in Massachusetts and Maine, and I'm here, but last week I was in Pennsylvania. And oftentimes I'm working in the front yard at my farmhouse, and people will go by and stop and visit and catch up with me. And one of the remaining elder ladies in the neighborhood stopped by. She's in her mid-90s, and she drove up and slammed on the brakes and said, "Dean, how are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm fine, Mary. How are you?" And she says, "I'm terrible. All my friends have died. I feel like I'm all alone." And so we talked a little bit along about that situation. And of course, she lives by herself in a big old farmhouse. And then I said, "Well, church must be good. That ought to be fun." And she said, "Oh, they've changed everything. Nothing is like it used to be. I just can't stand all this change. And the new minister who has come, I just don't understand what he's doing most of the time." And it was kind of an unhappy moment. And I kept trying to be reassuring to her that life is good, life goes on, and you're surrounded by your family, but she just was in a negative place. One of those places that I call a border place. You see, right here is the center of my life, and in the center of my life, there is goodness, there is blessing, there is positiveness. But there are places in my life and in your lives that are kind of along the border. We step at times out of the center of our lives, and we go over here on the margin because we've lost someone or something very difficult is unfolding in our life, and we have a sorrow and an anxiety that is kind of consuming us. Over time, we heal, and we kind of step back into the center of our lives, and we feel better again, and life is kind, and there is a blessing about the living of life. And then something else will happen, and we step over to the other border, another margin. Maybe we ourselves are ill, or a relationship is unraveling, or there are problems with kids, and life is filled with stress and uncertainty, and it lacks the goodness and the blessing that we feel back here in the center of where we like to be in the unfolding of our lives. We discover Jesus today in the Gospel of Luke, walking along a border. And Jesus, this happened with him a lot. He did not necessarily live his life or his ministry in the center of the Jewish culture. He often stepped toward the edge of the Jewish culture. Today, he's along the border with Samaria and Galilee, and he's in a little town, and he meets 10 people with skin disease, leprosy, sores all over their skin, which was common in the ancient world, is still common in some third world settings today. And they come to him, heard of him and of his goodness. He gives them a blessing. And he says, "Go to the priests, and as you go, you will be healed." And that was the practice of the day. If you were experiencing a healing, you were pronounced clean by the priest. So they journeyed, and as they were journeying, one of them, a Samaritan, And remember, a Samaritan is kind of a double outcast because that's not a full-blooded Jew. This is a foreigner with whom you really did not spend your time or associate. You generally looked down on Samaritans if you were a mainstream Jew. It is the Samaritan who comes back, interesting in Jesus' story, and says, "Thank you. My life is good again. I'm healed. I'm a new person. Thank you." And it's almost stunning in that the others are so caught up in the realization that life is good, so caught up in the wonder of it all that a life that was destroyed probably forever by this awful skin disease is now whole again. They are so caught up in perhaps the feeling of joy, excitement, or kind of self-congratulation that they don't come back and say, "Thank you." This happens. It's normal, it's natural. A lot of times in the living of our lives, when things are good, we take it so for granted. We enjoy the moment, we celebrate it, we have a great time. And then when things are bad, that's when we find our way to God and say, "Please, God, notice me, notice the calamity in my life, be present with me, guide me, help me." And the whole time, the entire time, when we were out here on the margin, on the border, and when we're in the center of our life, in the midst of the goodness, the whole time God was very much with us, in spirit, in nurture, in concern, in care, not unlike how we are as parents or grandparents are always mindful of our children or our grandchildren, always concerned for their happiness, wholeness of life, safety, well-being. We know what it is like to always be thinking of them. And that's the way it is with God. God is always thinking of us. Last night, when I had gotten back from the men's retreat, Kathy, my wife, and I were out for a walk in our neighborhood. And we're very blessed because two of our grandchildren are in the neighborhood. And Ellie, who's going to kindergarten now, was out on her razor on the front walk, and she saw us coming down the sidewalk, and she comes toward us, and she says, "What are the two of you up to?" And I said, "Well, we're up to taking a walk." "Oh, well, I would like to walk with you. Can I bring my razor along?" And so she went back and asked her dad if she could go, and that would be fine, and we went for a walk.